Claire Davis's peaceful life shattered when her neighbor, Harry Lawrence, used a fake maintenance request to sneakily expand his massive deck right onto her property. The man had a history of charming his way through red tape, bending rules and trampling boundaries, all while acting like the perfect suburban gentleman. But this time, Claire had a plan of her own, one that would unleash a storm of public outrage and leave Harry scrambling for cover. And trust me, you won't believe how this battle for justice turned into a triumph that shook the entire neighborhood. Claire Davis stretched out on her wicker lounge chair, basking in the gentle warmth of the morning sun. The sound of chirping birds echoed softly in the distance, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. This was her sanctuary, her own little slice of suburban bliss. With a contented sigh, she reached for her glass of lemonade, savoring the tranquility. The calm was broken by the sound of a gate creaking open. Claire sat up slightly, shielding her eyes as she spotted her neighbor, Harry Lawrence, walking toward her with an almost too friendly grin plastered across his face. He carried a few rolled-up blueprints under his arm. Harry was the kind of neighbor who was always polite, maybe a little too involved in everyone's business, but never overtly troublesome. "Morning, Claire. Hope I'm not interrupting," Harry greeted cheerfully. "Harry, good morning. What's going on?" Claire asked, raising an eyebrow, already sensing she might regret this conversation. She was in no mood for a long chat, but she kept her tone civil. Harry chuckled lightly and raised his hands in a gesture of harmlessness. "Nothing too serious. I just wanted to talk about the fence between our properties. It's in pretty rough shape, falling apart, really. And you know how strict the city inspectors can be about this kind of thing," he explained, pausing for effect. "Anyway, I was hoping I could get temporary access to your side of the yard so my workers can repair it. It'll only take a couple of days, tops, just to reach the tricky spots." Claire frowned slightly. The request didn't seem unreasonable. The fence did look like it needed work, and Harry, despite his quirks, had never crossed any lines with her before. I guess that's fine. Just make sure they don't leave any mess behind, all right?" she replied after a brief hesitation. "Of course. You have my word. Everything will be spotless," Harry promised, flashing a reassuring smile. With that, Claire gave a small nod and returned to her morning peace, unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. A week later, Claire stood frozen on her back porch, her mouth agape in disbelief. Her once sunny yard was now overshadowed by an enormous wooden deck that Harry had begun constructing. The deck stretched across most of his property, but also encroached onto her land, with several planks and supports blatantly crossing the boundary line. Workers stomped around her yard as if they had every right to be there. Claire's hands clenched into fists as fury bubbled inside her. She stormed over to Harry's property, where he was casually supervising the construction. He didn't even flinch when she approached, looking completely unbothered by her presence. "What the hell is this, Harry?" she demanded, her voice sharp and trembling with anger. Harry turned to face her, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Oh, Claire, it's just part of the project. Don't worry, it's all perfectly legal," he said smoothly, as if that explanation would magically pacify her. "Legal? Are you kidding me? You never mentioned anything about building a deck, let alone one that crosses into my yard." Harry shrugged nonchalantly, his posture relaxed, as if he couldn't comprehend why she was so upset. "Well, the permits were approved. Everything's in order." Claire felt a surge of white-hot rage. This wasn't just some minor misunderstanding. This was outright deception. The nerve of him, standing there with that smug indifference. Without another word, she spun around and stormed back to her house, her mind racing. He might think he could get away with this, but Claire knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let it slide. Every morning, Claire Davis would wake up, hoping the nightmare had somehow vanished overnight. But it hadn't. Instead, she'd peer out her window and see her once peaceful backyard overrun by construction. Workers clanged metal tools, saws screeched like banshees, and planks of wood lay scattered across the lawn. Harry's deck was growing like a monster out of control, inching closer to her property line every day. The worst part wasn't even the noise or the chaos. It was the invasion of privacy. Harry had installed a multi-level deck with a high platform, and now anyone standing on it had a direct line of sight into her kitchen and living room windows. It was like living in a fishbowl. His guests would casually lean on the deck's railing, drinks in hand, openly staring into her home as if she were some kind of suburban exhibit. She couldn't even relax in her own living room without feeling exposed. Claire felt trapped and violated in a way she had never experienced before. Her house, once a place of safety, now felt like a stage where she was forced to perform under constant scrutiny. She avoided her windows, pulled the curtains tight, and even started changing rooms just to avoid being seen. Each time she caught a glimpse of someone glancing in, a wave of humiliation and anger washed over her. It was unbearable. Determined to put an end to it, Claire contacted the local building inspector, explaining the situation and pleading for an urgent investigation. She hoped there had been some mistake, some rule that Harry had broken, but the inspector delivered a crushing blow. Harry had already secured the necessary permits. According to the official paperwork, everything was in compliance. How is that even possible? Claire asked, incredulous. The inspector hesitated before adding something that made her blood boil. Well, it's not uncommon for people to bend the truth a bit when filing permits. Sometimes details slip through the cracks. Bend the truth? Claire repeated, her voice shaking with anger. Harry had lied. He had manipulated the system to get what he wanted, just like he always did. The news spread fast. Neighbors started gossiping, recounting stories of how Harry had pulled similar stunts in the past, like that time he had quietly extended his driveway onto public land or planted hedges right up to a neighbor's garage without permission. He had a reputation for exploiting loopholes and charming his way out of trouble. Typical Harry, one neighbor muttered to Claire during a tense conversation. He always knows how to game the system. People talk, but no one ever really does anything about it. That was the last straw. Claire could feel her fury boiling just under the surface. She wasn't going to be another name on the list of people Harry had walked over. This time, he'd gone too far, and Claire was determined to fight back. Claire realized that playing by the rules wouldn't get her anywhere, at least not with someone like Harry Lawrence. He had already rigged the system in his favor, and the city's bureaucracy wasn't going to help her. If she wanted justice, she'd have to outsmart him at his own game. Her first step was to consult a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Monica Green, who had a reputation for taking on cases involving property disputes and shady developers. Monica listened intently as Claire described every detail, the deceptive request for access, the ever-growing deck encroaching on her land, and the supposed legal permits Harry had secured. After reviewing the documentation, Monica smirked and leaned back in her chair. "Well, Claire, I've got good news and bad news," she said. The good news: Harry's permit may be technically approved, but there are multiple building code violations here. Setback requirements, height limits, privacy regulations. He's cut a lot more corners than I expected. The bad news: this could still be tied up in red tape for months if we go through the usual channels. Months? Claire shook her head. I can't live like this for that long. Monica gave her a knowing look. Then we make noise, a lot of noise. Over the next few days, Claire and Monica got to work. Claire documented everything. Photos of the towering deck, videos showing how Harry's guests could peer into her windows, and audio recordings of conversations where Harry casually admitted the project details. Armed with this evidence, they had a solid case, but Claire wasn't done yet. She took a bold step, something Harry never saw coming. Claire crafted a detailed post and published it on the local community forum and several social media platforms. The post, titled "How My Neighbor Hijacked My Backyard Legally," laid out her story with all the incriminating details. She included photos of the towering monstrosity, screenshots of her conversation with the building inspector, and a call to action. Have you experienced something similar with Harry Lawrence? Share your story. Let's hold him accountable. The response was explosive. Within hours, the post went viral in the local community. Comments poured in from neighbors who had been victims of Harry's antics. He expanded his driveway onto my property last year, said it was temporary, and never moved it. Oh my God, he did the same thing with my fence, claimed it was a shared boundary when it wasn't. Harry's been doing this for years. No one ever challenges him because he's so good at schmoozing the inspectors. The public outrage grew louder with each passing day. Local activists shared the post, tagging city council members and even reporters. Within a week, Claire's story caught the attention of a local news station. They reached out for an interview, which Claire nervously agreed to, determined to stay composed and tell her side of the story. The pressure on Harry intensified. Reporters showed up at his house, cameras rolling. When questioned, he seemed visibly rattled for the first time. His usual charm faltered as he stammered through vague responses like, "It's all a misunderstanding," and "The permits were approved, there's no issue here." But the journalists weren't buying it. Meanwhile, Claire's story continued to gain traction online. The hashtag #StopHarryTheBuilder began trending locally, and city officials found themselves inundated with complaints. Public opinion turned against Harry like a tidal wave, and he couldn't dodge the backlash. His name, once a symbol of quiet influence in the neighborhood, was now associated with deceit and abuse of power. Claire watched the fallout unfold with a mix of relief and satisfaction. For once, Harry wasn't the one pulling the strings. Now, he was on the defensive, and Claire knew she was just getting started. Under the crushing weight of public outrage and the looming threat of a lawsuit, Harry Lawrence's arrogance finally cracked. He had spent years manipulating the system to his advantage, but this time, he was out of moves. The city's building department, now under intense scrutiny thanks to Claire's viral campaign and media coverage, issued a formal inspection of his property. It didn't take long for them to confirm multiple violations, including encroachment onto Claire's land and failure to adhere to privacy and height regulations. Claire's lawyer, Monica, delivered the ultimatum with ruthless precision. Either Harry voluntarily dismantled the illegal parts of his deck, or he would face a long, expensive court battle he was unlikely to win. For a man who prided himself on being untouchable, this moment of reckoning was a bitter pill to swallow. A few days later, Claire stood at the edge of her property, watching as construction workers, Harry's workers no less, began the process of tearing down the offending sections of the deck. The sound of hammers and saws, which had once filled her with dread, now brought a deep sense of vindication. Piece by piece, the towering monstrosity was reduced to rubble. The sections that had invaded her space were removed entirely, restoring her yard to its former serenity. Neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle, many of them openly enjoying Harry's downfall. Some even brought lawn chairs and drinks, treating it like a neighborhood event. "Looks like karma finally caught up with him," one man chuckled, raising a beer in Claire's direction. When the work was done, Claire allowed herself a moment to take it all in. The deck was now smaller, confined strictly to Harry's property, and the invasive platform that had loomed over her windows was gone. She exhaled deeply, the tension that had gripped her for weeks finally beginning to ease. But Claire didn't stop there. With the help of her lawyer and some community activists, she pushed for changes to local building codes. The new regulations included stricter requirements for privacy protection and clearer guidelines on property boundaries. The reforms were passed unanimously by the city council, largely thanks to the overwhelming public support Claire had garnered. Her fight became a catalyst for broader change, and she was no longer just the woman who stood up to Harry Lawrence. She was a symbol of neighborhood empowerment. A few weeks later, Claire hosted a backyard barbecue to celebrate. The same yard that had once felt like a prison was now full of life and laughter. Neighbors mingled, kids played tag on the grass, and the scent of grilled burgers filled the air. Claire moved through the crowd, smiling as people came up to thank her for standing up to Harry. At one point, she glanced over to Harry's yard. He was nowhere to be seen. No surprise there. Since the public backlash, he had been keeping a low profile, avoiding eye contact with Claire whenever their paths crossed. It was a small but satisfying victory. As the sun set and the backyard was illuminated by string lights, Claire felt a profound sense of triumph. She had fought for her home, her peace of mind, and her dignity, and she had won. Justice at last had prevailed.